following program discusses the World Trade Center Memorial. Because the designs are subject to final approval and may change, the lecturer has requested that certain images be withheld from broadcast.
Our guest, Alice Greenwald, joined the World Trade Center Memorial Foundation in April 2006 as the Executive Vice President for Programs and Director of the Memorial Museum. In this capacity, she is responsible for managing and overseeing the articulation and implementation of a vision for the planned World Trade Center Memorial Museum. Admittedly, a Herculean task that she will be talking about this evening. Before joining the World Trade Center Memorial Foundation, Ms. Greenwald served as Associate Director for Museum Programs at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, one of the nation's great sites of memory and conscience. There, she oversaw the Division of Collections, Exhibitions, Education, Library, and Museum Services, and supervised staff heading the museum's National Institute for Holocaust Education and the Wexner Learning Center. Ms. Greenwald enjoyed a long association with the Holocaust Memorial Museum, having served since 1986 as a technical expert and consultant in a variety of capacities, including as a member of the original design team for the museum's permanent exhibitions. From 1986 to 2001, Ms. Greenwald was the principal of Alice M. Greenwald Museum Services, providing consulting expertise to a variety of clients in addition to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. She served as a guest curator for the Historical Society of Princeton exhibition titled Old Traditions, New Beginnings, 250 Years of Princeton Jewish History. Her other clients include the Baltimore Museum of Industry, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the National Museum of American Jewish History. Prior to the establishment of her consulting business, Ms. Greenwald served as Executive Director of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia and held positions at Hebrew Union College's Skirball Museum in Los Angeles and the Maurice Spertus Museum of Judaica in Chicago. Ms. Greenwald is the author of numerous articles that explore the intersections of religion, history, and material culture. Alice Greenwald has said that, quote, "Without memory, we are much diminished human beings." Tonight, she has promised to reflect on the distinction between sites of memory and sites of conscience, and how her 19-year affiliation with the Holocaust Museum has shaped and informed her approach, her vision to the development of the World Trade Center Memorial Museum. Please join me in warmly welcoming Alice Greenwald to the University of Michigan.
Good evening. Thank you, Ray, very much, and Dr. Bluen. And I want to just open by saying how privileged I am to be giving a talk on a project that is so centrally concerned with memory, in memory of an apparently extraordinary woman. So thank you for that honor. This is actually my first visit to the University of Michigan. I have two children, and I don't know how we missed this one on the college search weekends that we spent, but it's a privilege to be here. It's a pleasure to be here, and I got here early enough in the day today to take a walk around campus. It's beautiful, and to do what I do in my free time, which is to go to museums. I'm incorrigible on that front, and I walked into the University Museum of Natural History and immediately saw a phrase that was stunning to me. It was a quote from a man who apparently was the curator and director of that institution for many decades, an Alexander Ruthven, who wrote, "A finished museum is a dead museum. And by that reckoning, my project is alive and kicking." I am delighted to participate in this series on exhibiting controversy, particularly since the two projects with which I have been most affiliated in the last 2 decades of my life, the past 20 years, have been nothing if not controversial. I want to begin with an anecdote from one of them, from the planning of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, where I was privileged, as you've just heard, to be involved for 19 years, as a way of setting the stage for our discussion this evening. The most famous debate from the creation of the Holocaust Museum centered on whether or not we would present the hair of the victims. One of the most searing installations at the State Museum at Auschwitz is the display of human hair. Hair that was cut from prisoners and literally sold by the Nazis as the byproduct of mass murder, a byproduct of mass murder, to various factories for the manufacture of industrial felt, for stockings, to be spun into yarn, to be used as mattress stuffing. It is one of the most vivid examples of the Nazis' industrialization of mass murder. Murder that didn't end with the death of the victims, but continued with the processing, selling, and utilization of their possessions, the gold in their teeth, even their hair. There was a fierce debate about the hair, with many on the planning team arguing the necessity of including the hair in order to tell the whole story. There were other voices, and I was among them, who argued that this was different, that in the very act of preparing loan forms, customs declarations, and condition forms, we were continuing to treat the hair as a commodity, and in a way that seemed, even with the best of intentions, to continue to violate the memory of the victims. The debate raged for well over a year. But there was something about the difference between displaying hair at Auschwitz and in Washington, D.C., that was at the heart of the issue. Auschwitz is, after all, the site of the crime. It is a burial ground and a site of memory. The museum in D.C. is a site of conscience, remote from the acts of atrocity. Human remains did not belong there. As writer Ed Linenthal has described it, and I'm quoting now, it was human matter out of place, registering differently from rail cars or shoes. The hair was shipped to D.C. It was put in storage in Linthicum, Maryland. But in the end, it was the voice of a survivor that won the day, an advisor to our content committee who argued that for all she knew, it might be her mother's hair we were planning to put on exhibit. That was the end of the debate. It was no longer about varying opinions of propriety or appropriate locations for the display. It was about not violating the trust of the survivors. This same Ed Linenthal, who has written books chronicling the charged history of creating institutions of memory, including the Holocaust Museum in D.C. and the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum, has observed that, and again I quote him, "Controversy is not necessarily a bad thing. Rather, it is evidence of passion on all sides." The project with which I'm now affiliated, having arrived just a year ago, is the effort to create a memorial museum at the World Trade Center site in Lower Manhattan to commemorate the events of September 11, 2001 and February 26, 1993. And truly, there is passion on all sides. I'm going to take a few minutes to orient you to the site before I go into delineating some of the controversial issues that have been attending this project. This is just to give you a sense of what I'm referring to. This green quadrant here and the gray buildings on the edge of it represent the 16-acre World Trade Center site. Okay, from a bird's eye view, that's a significant amount of real estate in Lower Manhattan. Okay, you've got the Hudson here. You're down here where the ferry boats leave to go to the Statue of Liberty. Castle Clinton, you're on the East River here. Okay, South Street Seaport, World Trade Center Memorial. Okay. This is the site today. It's a construction zone. That there is the West Side Highway. The World Financial Center is there. For those of you who've been to the site recently, there is one rebuilt building, 7 World Trade. It is up and running and pretty much leased out. You've got what we call in the business the bathtub. This is the space that is basically 7 stories deep and 16 acres of space. That is the area being rebuilt. You've got Liberty Street here, Greenwich Street here, which is not open to the public right now. It will reopen when the site is rebuilt, and Fulton Street at the north edge. This wall here is the celebrated slurry wall. It's a retaining wall that holds back the Hudson River from flooding lower Manhattan. In the original master plan for the redevelopment of the World Trade Center site, Daniel Libeskind, the architect, felt that the slurry wall, by holding fast on 9/11, wasn't itself a symbol of resistance and resilience and strength and fortitude, and therefore it is considered a part of the historical assets of the site. Okay, and this is just the last slide I'm going to show right now, but this is just to orient you to the plaza, the Memorial Plaza. As I mentioned earlier, there's this periphery of buildings around the site. This here is the new transportation hub that's going to be rebuilt at the northeast corner. So here we are. Fulton is the north end, even though we're oriented this way, a little off and Greenwich is over to the east. Liberty is to the south, and West Street, of course, is to the west. You've got the 2 pools, which are occupying roughly the footprints of where the 2 trade towers stood. They will be inverse waterfalls. They will be inverse fountains. There'll be waterfalls falling down. You've got a treed plaza, and you've got a building in the middle on the east side of the plaza that is the museum entry building, our visitor orientation center. So I'm going to leave this up for a moment, and we'll take it down in a few minutes, but I just want you to have some kind of visual reference for what I'm going to be talking about. The controversies which have attended the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site and the creation of a memorial museum there have been numerous. Although I have to say they are not atypical for museums of memory focused on traumatic events. This comes with the territory. Among the most highly charged of the debates surrounding this project is the one over how to list the names of victims. You may have read in the paper about this. It is an issue that won't go away. It's been particularly controversial and was not very long ago addressed by the chairman of the World Trade Center Memorial Foundation, who also happens to be the sitting mayor of the city of New York, Michael Bloomberg. I'll tell you about his resolution in a moment. The questions that are being asked about the names are, should the names be randomly listed as originally proposed by the winning architect of the memorial design competition, Michael Arad, or should they be organized by affiliation, uniformed rescue personnel with their firehouses, for example, or employees of one firm clustered together? Which version communicates the right narrative? Can the deaths, while indiscriminate, truly be considered random if 9/11 was not an accidental series of events, but rather a planned and coordinated terrorist attack on multiple fronts? Or is there an inherent equality in death that transcends the particulars of one's individual life or the circumstances of dying? An equality that, even in this instance, suggests that there are no distinctions to be made, that we are all simply human beings in that moment of tragic loss? Or should, in fact, distinctions be made between civilians caught in the vortex of terror and destruction and those who, by virtue of their role and responsibility, chose to run into burning buildings? The resolution advanced by Mayor Bloomberg, which is an interesting compromise, is to provide for meaningful adjacencies that honor the primacy of place here at a historic site of an atrocity without over-annotating. The proposal is this. The north void, the north pool, will have names inscribed around the parapet, around the edge of the pool. And along its edges will be the names of those who perished in the North Tower and those who perished on American Flight 11, the plane that crashed into the tower, arranged in clusters that place co-workers together, family members side by side, without naming the companies or providing aegis. Along the South Pool, the proposal suggests, will be the names of all of those who died in the South Tower, World Trade Center 2, those on United Flight 175, the plane hijacked and crashed into the tower, those who perished at the Pentagon on Flight 77, in Shanksville on United Flight 93, the uniformed rescue personnel, the great majority of whom perished in the South Tower, those who perished in 1993 at the World Trade Center, and those without a particular association to one tower or the other who perished on 9/11. This is the proposal that has been put forward. Even with the mayor's compromise resolution, the names placement issue remains hotly debated among some of the family members, the families of victims, who are calling for greater detail about the individual victims, their loved ones. They want the names and the floors of the companies they worked for, the ages, and if they were rescue personnel, their ranks. For many, particularly those families who received no remains of their loved ones, and that figure is approximately 40% of 9/11 families, this memorial represents the only monument to their loss. We have here the extraordinary challenge of negotiating the very human impulse for private commemoration within a very public memorial. Earlier in the process, the issue of the names of victims focused on a very different controversy, their physical placement. Where did the names belong, not how would they be presented? Was it appropriate to place them below ground, as the memorial designer, Michael Arad, had first proposed? This scenario ran into numerous problems. There were questions of propriety for some religious traditions. There were issues of family members not wanting to go underground to honor their loved ones. There were issues of security. In the original design, you had to go down below the Memorial Plaza to get to where the names were listed in these open-air galleries below ground. And given the nature of this site, the security requirements were so steep and challenging. You had to have people going through magnetometers every time they went down one of these 4 ramps. So there were security issues, which then created traffic congestion, flow in and out issues, and there was the matter of cost. Okay, another controversial issue. How do you approach this site itself? Is it an archaeological site to be treated with reverence? Is it more akin to a battleground or a cemetery? Are the multiple expectations of this project to memorialize and to rebuild an urban neighborhood compatible? Can you have a cultural institution situated on a site where people have died? This last question was, in fact, central to one of the plans a few years ago when the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, the LMDC, promoted a cultural building on the site that would house an institution called the Freedom Center, together with an arts organization called the Drawing Center. In addition, a performing arts center has been planned across the Memorial Quadrant on Fulton, and it's still in planning. It would be located right about here. Okay, here's the entry to the museum. Here's the North Pool with the names around it, and there's a performing arts center across the street. That center is planned to house the Signature Theater Company and the Joyce, a venue for dance performance, great venue. For some, this was tantamount to a violation of memory. Can you, should you, these folks asked, be dancing on the graves of the victims? Or another way to look at this, how do you balance urban renewal, the clear need to redevelop a 16-acre site in the heart of the world's most vibrant urban business district, with the equally urgent impulse to memorialize? How do you reconcile the expectation of restoring 10 million square feet of leasable office space with a constant reminder across the street that there has been a history of repeated vulnerability here, that this site has been and may well remain a target of terrorists? To cut to the chase, how do you rent the space you rebuild in this environment? What takes precedence here? Here's another example of our challenge. The planned new path transportation hub over here. It's being designed by one of the great world architects, Santiago Calatrava. It is planned to be a magnificent new station that will serve 40,000 commuters daily from New Jersey at a cost of nearly $2 billion and rising. It promises to be a major urban artistic statement, but the skylight over the mezzanine in the PATH station falls exactly here, within the northeast corner of the Memorial Quadrant. How large should that skylight be? Is it safe for visitors who are walking over what is the primary pathway to the museum entrance and alongside the North Pool, which now has the names of victims alongside it? What is the relationship of the skylight to that memorial and to the trees that are designed to provide a park-like environment for contemplation apart from the urban landscape? And who makes that decision? Here's another one. I could go on. The unidentified remains of the victims of the World Trade Center attacks on 9/11. There are 14,000 unidentified remains in the custody of the Office of the City Medical Examiner. Over 40% of families, as I just mentioned, have received nothing of their loved ones due to the circumstances of this tragedy. Do these human remains belong at this site? Where else would you place them? For so many of the families of victims, this is the only burial ground they will ever come to mourn their loss. And so, a requirement of this museum project, I think it's probably the only museum in the world with this requirement, is in fact to accommodate the unidentified remains. How then do you balance this overtly memorial project, what you will have is the equivalent of a mausoleum on site, with the educational obligation of a museum to convey a historical narrative? Can commemoration and education coexist? These are just some of the questions that this project has had to negotiate, a set of controversies that are exacerbated by our proximity to the event itself. It's only been 5 years, 5.5 years. The fact that key constituencies are still traumatized by grief, both personal and communal. The equally valid, though often incompatible, agendas of municipal redevelopment and memorialization. And not least, the intensely public and often politicized nature of this planning and building effort, which commemorates an event that is at the same time highly local, distinctly national, and essentially global. I'm going to shut this off now, and we're just going to talk for a while, and then I'll come back to the visuals. So before I share with you some of the thinking about and resolutions to these particular challenges of this project, I first want to share with you my own approach to memorials, and particularly museums dedicated to remembrance. I've thought a lot about museums and memory. My 19 years at the Holocaust Museum led me to understand one basic thing, that it is the space between cognitive understanding and emotional intelligence where memory resides. The space between cognitive understanding and emotional intelligence. What do I mean by this? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In 2005, during the week when the country mourned the loss of civil rights activist Rosa Parks, and when her body lay in repose at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, every public bus in Montgomery County, Maryland, carried a sign on a seat at the front of the bus, and it simply read, "Reserved for Rosa Parks." This simple gesture, to leave a seat empty, conveyed more than the words themselves could express: a sense of respect, an affirmation of our shared history, and a celebration of the power of collective memory to compel reflection, if not action. Okay, another example, Berlin. I don't know how many of you have been there recently, but this is a city that is literally sprouting memorials. They're everywhere. Some are more effective than others. There is a small, very subtle, but omnipresent memorial project in Berlin. It's actually all over Germany right now. And it is surprisingly effective. It's called the Stolpersteine Project, and Stolpersteine means stumbling stones. You'll be walking on a street in Berlin, and you look down, and embedded into the pavement is a little brass cobblestone. And on this little brass cobblestone is a name, and it says Alice Greenwald, born January 2nd, 1918, deported April 15th, 1943. That's all it says. Okay, and you look where you are, and you look at the house you're standing in front of, and you know that that person lived in that house, and you know that that neighbor was deported, and you know that nobody stopped it. And you go all over the city, and these stones are there. And they're there not only as markers, but they're quite literally stumbling blocks, stumbling stones. They're meant to trip you up psychologically, cognitively, and spiritually. So what's the connection between the buses in Maryland and the stones in Berlin? Both point to absence and to the encounter with the void. Through the lens of absence, we are brought to another level of understanding. We see the world differently. So what's the role of museums in this context? Unlike the World Trade Center site, which is for all intents and purposes an historic site, most museums are not sites of memory. The Holocaust Museum, for example, commemorates events that did not happen on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Yet it is emphatically a place where one might have an encounter with remembrance. And through the alchemy of the act of remembering, it becomes a site of conscience. And this is key. Memorial museums, those like the Holocaust Museum that are not where the events took place, and those like Oklahoma City where they are ultimately about the way we remember. For example, the Holocaust Museum has a dedicated focus. It is very self-consciously not a museum of genocides. It is rather a museum dedicated to the memory of a particular genocide, an event of such magnitude, it actually gave birth to the word genocide itself. That's another lecture. But it gives us a lesson for planning the World Trade Center Memorial Museum. In its intense particularity, the Holocaust Museum is able to speak to something bigger than the history it represents. It speaks to conscience and the need to act in the face of genocide. Some of you may be aware that in the last 2 or 3 years, the Holocaust Museum has been in the forefront of the advocacy for action to stop the genocide in Darfur. This past Thanksgiving, the museum took an extraordinary step and used the building itself to bear witness to what's going on in Darfur and projected images of the genocide, of the refugees in Chad, and of what's going on with these burned villages onto the exterior of the Hall of Remembrance on 15th Street. So the building itself carried the imagery of the very human behavior it has been established to argue against. It changes what we understand witness to be. I think we at the World Trade Center Memorial site have an opportunity and an obligation to remember equally well so that the intense and immediate particularity of 9/11 can also speak to bigger concerns. So there are certain presumptions of our planning effort. First, the very specificity of our location, the fact that we are at a site of atrocity, requires that we focus intently on what happened there. The fact requires a certain sensibility of presentation and focus. Our first priority must be to honor the commemorative and memorial functions of the site and to recognize that lives were lost there. The affect of this museum must be respectful and reverential. We would expect it to be deeply emotional. And so the particularity of the site itself helps to define our mission and our focus. Secondly, the specificity of what happened there has to be our primary story. Not just the horrific events of the day, but the response of the community, the uniformed rescue personnel, New Yorkers, Americans from every state, including Michigan, the world community. Ultimately, the story must be about the people affected by this event. It must be a story about people very much like you and me, people who got up in the morning, got their cup of coffee, sat down at their desk, and got caught in the vortex of global events. People ask, will this be a museum about terrorism? Our answer is that this will be a museum that focuses on the very real impact of terrorism in the lives of very real people and their families, their friends, their colleagues, and their communities. And ultimately, by focusing on the human story, this museum will, we hope, become a moral platform attesting to the indefensibility of terrorism, to the absolute unacceptability of indiscriminate mass murder as a response to grievance. Now, I must tell you that when I have given this lecture previously, that last sentence has been a source of immense controversy. I was at a meeting recently of an organization that involves individuals closely affiliated with 9/11, family members, survivors of the towers, local residents of Lower Manhattan. And at the end of my talk, a gentleman came up to me, and he was shaking with anger and took great offense at my use of the word grievance. And he argued that even to acknowledge that others in this world might have a grievance with the American way of life, with American values, was tantamount to legitimizing the attacks. So you can see how extraordinarily sensitive and how emotionally charged this entire subject is. So to begin with, we start from a basic premise, rooted in the primacy of place and referencing particular events, that this is a museum which will memorialize those who perished at the World Trade Center site on 9/11/2001 and also in February 1993, as well as those who perished at the Pentagon and in Shanksville on 9/11. But if we do our job well, and we have to, we have no choice, this museum will do more than tell the story of 9/11. It will be a place of inquiry and debate, a museum that becomes a lens, or perhaps a mirror, for understanding ourselves and the world in which we live. The museum must be about each of us, what it means to be a human being, and what it means to live in a complex global community at the start of the 21st century. That's our charge. But how do we make a museum? A great deal had been done before I arrived last spring. The Lower Manhattan Development Corporation had led a planning effort with a group called the Memorial Center Advisory Committee. The MCAC had produced reams of paper, as bureaucracies tend to do, but they were good papers. They were extensive and thoughtfully constructed lists of topics that would need to be addressed in any interpretive center on the Memorial Quadrant. The LMDC also retained curatorial consultants who explored how these various subjects might be visualized and presented using available artifactual resources, stories, photographs, and film. They did a lot of basic legwork. But to one degree or another, all that work was insufficient. It addressed only the what of our project, not the so what. So we decided last spring to step back and to ask the big questions. What kind of museum did we want to build? Who were we building the museum for? We convened a museum planning conversation series and invited representatives of all key constituencies to participate so they might be in the same room at the same time and hear each other's visions of this project. We explored a series of questions. We started with, what is a 21st century museum going to look like? We invited Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimlet, who is a professor of performance studies at NYU, to join us and to speak about museums as distinctive learning environments. This is mostly for those of you in the museum studies program right now. We call her BKG because her name is unpronounceable after the first time. And BKG explored the idea of museums as places of engagement and dialogue, interaction and exploration, framing the new museology as neither static nor top-down. Museums of the 21st century would no longer be bastions where the curator knows best, but rather centers for a democratic approach to learning with an essentially communal environment. We looked at the whole issue of museums and memorialization, and we invited American historian Ed Linenthal in from the University of Indiana, who joined our conversation to address the distinctions between museums and memorials and the common challenges faced when memory is at the core of a museum project. We looked at the continuing impact of trauma and our relationship to that. Dr. Grady Bray, a trauma psychologist who works for Kenyon Corporation, Kenyon International, a disaster response organization that is generally hired by the federal government in the aftermath of tsunamis and airplane disasters. Dr. Bray came in and helped us think through what we needed to understand about the psychology of loss so as not to re-traumatize our public when they came in the door. We looked at the American historical narrative. Is 9/11 a part of the American historical narrative? If so, how? Professor Steve Breyer of the City University of New York Graduate Center and co-founder of the 9/11 Digital Archive joined the great Civil War historian David Blight of Yale. And together they had this very lively conversation about how and whether 9/11 fits within American history. Is it a story of sacrifice like the Civil War? Well, for some people, it is. I have been to a number of events, particularly with the FDNY, and the bagpipers come in, and they are playing this music that, my God, you know, the tears start rolling the minute you hear those sounds. And, you know, first it's Danny Boy, and the next selection is Shenandoah. Okay, they're making a connection to the Civil War. We better pay attention to that. Is it more like Pearl Harbor? Is it an American story at all? Or is it really a global narrative? Together, we noted the humbling fact of our immense responsibility in creating this museum, that in the very act of making curatorial choices about how we're going to tell the story, we are in effect assuming the role of historiographers, and we're creating the historical narrative. That's challenging and terrifying at the same time. We're codifying the history simply by creating the museum. Finally, we invited one of your own, Harold Scramstead, a longtime director of the Henry Ford Museum in Deerfield Village, one of the preeminent thinkers in the museum profession, to talk to us about museums as instruments of civic renewal. Well, what could be more appropriate for a museum at a site that is in the process of urban redevelopment? Dr. Scramstead helped us consider the implications and the opportunities of the fact that museums are collective experiences rather than individualized learning environments, that they reflect cultural values and reinforce them, and perhaps most importantly, that museums can be agents of self-reflection, transformation, and even cultural change. But how does all this play out in a memorial museum situated at the heart of one of the largest urban redevelopment efforts in American history? Just to give you some perspective, the World Trade Center site, its 16 acres, is the rough equivalent of the entire business district of downtown Atlanta, Georgia. Imagine rebuilding Atlanta, Georgia. So when people say, "What's taking you so long?" I like to give them that little factoid, because we are in the midst of probably the most complex urban jigsaw puzzle in the world. This is the tension of culture versus memory that has hounded this project at this site. Should this museum be about cultural and creative defiance in the face of destruction, celebrating human achievement as a way of proving you cannot knock us down, the "we'll show you" attitude, the instinct that by rebuilding even bigger, even better, we'll show them? Or is this site the equivalent of a battlefield, sacred ground hallowed by the loss of life that needs to be bounded, sanctified, differentiated, and honored? Within the context of all of these questions, we have put our core creative team in place, and we've begun the iterative process of envisioning this memorial museum. I'm going to take you now through our plans as they are today. The one point of no controversy in my talk is the fact that this is subject to change. It will certainly change from here, but this will give you a sense of how we're conceiving this project. Okay, so now you know where we are. We're at the plaza. We've got this quadrant of 8 of the 16 acres, so roughly half of the site has been dedicated to memory. It is envisioned as a site separate from the city. The trees will be densely planted. It will be a park, and you will have these 2 nearly 1 acre volume of waterfalls, of inverse fountains. They're inverting the verticality of the towers down, and at the center of each, there is a void literally a hole that the water falls into. It will be a place apart from the rest of the city. The pools themselves will be loud. The sound of waterfalls filling an acre of space will be significant. The sound itself will be a buffer from the noise of the city. These renderings have already changed. Okay, and we're now looking at a different way of doing the parapet around the pools, but this gives you a rough idea of what it will look like. And this slide, interestingly enough, the red dotted line defines how the shape of the museum below ground is contoured by the requirements of the space above. And you'll see that below. We have the world's most peculiarly shaped museum because we actually occupy the space below the area where the towers stood. And we have to continue to accommodate a subterranean rail line that continues to work, the PATH train that goes along here. Okay. This building here is our museum entry. It is planned to have a glass atrium on the west side of the building, and the plan is to enclose in that atrium a signature artifact that speaks to the verticality of these buildings, to the enormity of scale, and to the enormity of the destruction. We're thinking at this time, I don't recall, well, yeah, you can see them right there, okay. For New Yorkers, this is an iconic emblem. For people outside New York, it may not be as obvious. But the face of the World Trade Center was aluminum facing. And as you looked up these vertical spandrels that went all the way up, from about the 5th to the 12th story were these trident-like structures. They were like, only they were covered in aluminum. And they created almost a Gothic arch effect at the bottom of the towers, and then it went straight up in vertical lines. These are two of the tridents that survived when the buildings fell. There's a collection of debris that was removed from the site. It is currently in a hangar at JFK under the custodial auspices of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. It represents about 0.5% of the millions of tons of debris that were removed from the site. And we will select two of these tridents, hopefully, and install them in the atrium so that from the outside of the building, you will have this visual conversation between the trees, the living trees on the plaza, and the architectural trees that are the living witnesses, the silent witnesses to the buildings that are no longer there. As I just mentioned, they only rose about 5 or 6 stories of a 110-story building. You will physically be dwarfed by them when you see them and stand next to them. That will give you a sense of, just multiply by 20 and get a sense of what these buildings were like. This section is an architectural section just meant to give you a sense of how the building will work. We will have the entry building. You will then descend via escalator, elevator, or stair past the tridents into a mid-level floor called Memorial Hall. And it's here that you will actually see the waterfall that's falling from above hit the pools at that level. So you'll see the water hitting the pools, and you will also have the daylight coming through the voids in the center. So you'll have the light reflected on the water in this Memorial Hall, which is, for all intents and purposes, our lobby. It's our concourse space, and it's here that we believe our journey for our museum visitors begins. At the plaza level, we will have, as you might well imagine, intense security screening. And we're trying to think creatively about ways to do a kind of meta interpretation of what is a necessity in this situation, an onerous necessity, but make it meaningful. And in fact, it's dead on with our subject matter. It grows out of we wouldn't have this kind of security were it not for 9/11. We've all had that experience at airports. If we can make our public conscious of the fact that the very thing they're doing to get into the museum is in fact directly linked to what this museum is chronicling, I think we'll manage to make it a somewhat tolerable experience. One of the challenges of designing this museum is that obviously most of the artifacts speak about the loss of buildings. The tridents are a perfect example. The pools themselves occupy the space where buildings stood. How do you bring into a conversation about buildings and the loss of buildings and mourning the loss of buildings, the real story here, which is the loss of human beings. So one of our thoughts is that the journey itself, as you go downstairs from the entry level down to Memorial Hall, and then you continue along a ramp that brings you all the way down 7 stories to bedrock, that it is actually a journey of discovery, of remembrance. It's a journey into the story. It's a journey deeper into this place that once held these buildings, so it has an archaeological feel to it. But it's also, in a way, almost mythic. It's a journey into the underworld, literally and figuratively. And we are working with designers to figure out ways to convey that mythic quality of this journey. And there's some interesting components that I'm not yet at liberty to share, but they will be quite remarkable when we can tell you and when you can experience them. At the Memorial Hall level, after you view these pools, you will enter as a visitor into our opening visitor experience, which we're conceiving of as a not didactic sort of this is what happened that day experience, but rather, thank you so much, rather a way, and this will be on this level here. I'm going to just move to the next slide. Okay, so here you've gone through security screening, and this is the sort of atrium landing. You'll go down these escalators. You'll come down. You'll be in Memorial Hall. This is a pathway to the pools on either side. There will be an overlook to give you a sense of the cavernous space that the space occupies. So you'll have a sense of the verticality of the space you're in. You're now descending. And then you will go into this corridor here and begin your journey into this first exhibition space. So again, just another drawing here. You've come down here. You've got the base of the tridents coming up here. You've got a view into the pool, and just give you a sense of scale here. You're looking just at one corner of the acre-sized pool of water. The south pool is here. You will then begin your journey into an opening exhibition. And we envision that exhibition as being the first place that we can convey one of our key messages, which is that to one degree or another, everybody on the face of the planet has their own 9/11 story. Right? Doesn't matter where you are. You could have been in Antarctica that day. You have a 9/11 story. And as a way of affirming that this is, that we recognize that everyone walking in has their own entry narrative, the opening exhibition will be a way for that to be communicated, to convey that it was global. There will be people speaking in multiple languages, sharing their stories. One will then proceed down this ramp. It's a very slight incline. You probably wouldn't even know you were on a ramp, except that you're obviously getting closer down. You will come to an overlook here where you'll have your first significant vista of both the slurry wall, the area at bedrock, and the volumes that are actually containing all of the infrastructure holding up those acre worth of pools above you, the pumps and the mechanical equipment and the filters and all of that. Those volumes will be faced in a recycled aluminum material, which is, of course, the aluminum was the facing of the World Trade Center, that when theatrically lit will actually look ghostly. So it will look like buildings that aren't quite there. And we hope that that effect will communicate the sort of quality of memory. That even though we know that those are real structures holding up real equipment, and the pools are above them, that they will evoke a sense of the buildings that are no longer there. And you'll have that view at the first overlook over here. As you go down the ramp, there will be highly affective installations not meant to stop you in your tracks. You will, because we wouldn't want to back up there. We want people to keep moving on their way down. We don't want them to read labels. So it might be music, or it might be a film clip of Philippe Petit doing a tightrope walk between the towers, or it might be the opening images of Working Girl, which had this great vista of the towers from the Staten Island ferry. These are pieces, we call them breadcrumbs. They're breadcrumbs of our collective memory of the Trade Center towers. There might be audio of the sound of the tower, the door, the revolving door going around. They're not meant to convey anything but association, and also to begin to implant in your consciousness as you're walking into a space that is so heavily archaeological. You're looking down another 4 stories, you're looking at this immense space at bedrock, you're looking at the slurry wall, to remind you that this is really about people. So these are what will happen as you go down. You'll come to the end of the ramp. Here, you'll take an escalator. Let me get you to the next slide. You can actually see what I'm talking about. You'll have another overlook to a space that is between the 2 towers, and I'll talk about that in a moment. It's probably the most emotionally resonant space at Bedrock because it is between the 2 towers and privileges neither one over the other. But you'll have this second overlook, and then you'll go the last leg of your journey by escalator and arrive at Bedrock here between the 2 towers. I should just point out that there are 2 historical assets of the site that we are legally bound by federal landmark preservation legislation to preserve and make meaningfully accessible to the public. So we have to design our museum around that requirement. One is the slurry wall, and so we have to make the original slurry wall accessible visually. We also have to make available, you see these little squares here? In the process of removing all of the debris from the site at the World Trade Center, all of the structural columns, most of which collapsed and were pulverized, were cut off to create a flat surface. Where those structural columns were cut off, you have a clearly articulated square that is the top of a box column, the box structural column. And the box column remnants, which articulate, in fact, the actual footprint of the towers, are part of this historic asset. So we have to always make them available. So when you're standing on these overlooks, you will see the slurry wall chamber, you will see these little squares that mark the periphery of the tower footprints. Okay, so here's my museum. Isn't this a great site? Look at the shape of it. It's about 100,000 square feet. That's not insignificant space. It's a very interesting space that is entirely defined by what was once there and what is there now. So let me just give you a quick set of insights into the challenges we face in creating this museum. Let's see here now. This area here, I'm actually going to go back a minute before we provide that. The area here, which is just to the east of the museum demising wall, is where the PATH train runs. Okay, so we've got a train. We've got to make sure that we build a structure that doesn't vibrate, that keeps the noise of the train outside the museum. We've got, in this section of the site, the entire electrical and HVAC system for the entire World Trade Center, 16 acres. Okay, so all of that is here. We've got the slurry wall here. And we've got the North Tower footprint here with the box beam remnants around it. It is cut off in one corner by the PATH tracks. And then what is available to us of the south footprint is about half the size of the north footprint because of the rail that goes behind it. So it's an incredibly complicated site to make schematically comprehensible for visitors so that they understand what the traffic pattern is, and to make it meaningful in ways that, for example, just because the North Tower is the larger space doesn't privilege that, because for family members who lost loved ones in the South Tower, you don't want them to feel that somehow we have diminished the symbolic or emotional or educational value of the South footprint. So what we have come to is a proposal that is still subject to some redefinition, but we started with the various challenges that I've delineated previously this evening. And we looked at the East Chamber Gallery here and decided that rather than place the unidentified remains of the victims, which, as I told you before, is a requirement of our challenge here, of our project, in either one of the footprints. And the original memorial design the unidentified remains were going to be in the North Tower. And that was problematic for many reasons, but one of them was for families who had lost loved ones in the South Tower. They felt that that was somehow a violation of their experience. We felt that the appropriate place for that placement would be, in fact, at your point of arrival, so that the entire experience is conditioned by a recognition that this is a burial site, that people lost their lives here, and that that lens is what you look through to see the rest of the history, that it conditions how you understand the site. So we have placed that here. We've decided, and now I'll move to the next slide to give you a sense of how we're identifying spaces. We've decided that the North Tower would be the locus, because it is the largest single bounded space at Bedrock, that it would be the space where we would tell our narrative story. It would be our primary exhibition space up here. I'll go into this in a minute. The South Tower would be given over to three primary components. One is an exhibition that would be appropriate for younger visitors because of the nature of the subject matter, which has very disturbing imagery, as you can imagine. We believe that it's morally indefensible to give parents no choice in exposing children to highly traumatic imagery. And we felt that we really had an obligation to provide an alternate path experience that would be emotionally and intellectually and cognitively safe and appropriate for various developmental considerations. And then adjacent to it would be we were talking about this at dinner, a digital resource center, which would be a dynamic space, not a place where you would go in and sit at a computer and do something on site, although maybe we would have a few stations for that. But it's really meant to be a place where you can access all kinds of material, be in dialogue with other people, and perhaps even there would be a recording studio in there so you could leave your recordings. And in the center of the South Tower would be a memorial installation that would allow us to convey the personalized information about the individual victims that the memorial itself can't accommodate with the listing of the names. What we call the interstitial spaces in between the two tower volumes provide both transitional space as well as space where we can accommodate some of the larger monumental artifacts. That is because, as I mentioned a moment ago, these are all the things that we have to juggle. The tower volumes that are holding up the pools bring the ceiling of the primary exhibition spaces in the North and South Tower footprints down to 15 feet high. Okay, so we have low ceilings in the primary exhibition. You can't put a 35-foot column in a room that has a 15-foot ceiling unless you lay it prone. So the spaces in between, this is about 60 feet high, this is about 20 feet high, and this is 70 feet high in the slurry wall chamber, give us the spaces where we can actually accommodate some of the large monumental artifacts that help to tell the story. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the plans for this area and to relate back to the mythic resonances that I had talked about a minute ago. There's an extraordinary artifact in the hangar at JFK, Hangar 17. It is extraordinary on many levels, but I honestly don't think there's anything like it in the world because it is rooted in this story. It's called the composite. And what the composite is well, you look at it and it looks like a piece of molten lava that has cooled, or it looks like a piece of basalt, and it's about the size of that table. And what it is 4 floors of one of the towers compressed together by the force of the collapse of these 110-story buildings that was molten because of the intensity of the flames and the fire for an extended period of time. It is pockmarked. It has a moonscape. Remarkably, it has pieces of carbonized paper on which you can see, because it's been carbonized, it's like petrified writing, handwriting. So it's intensely intimate. And we have to assume, given the circumstances of this history, that human remains are contained in the composite. How do you deal with an artifact like that? Do you just put it on display with a label in the midst of a narrative exhibition? Obviously, you can't do that. Highly sensitive, very difficult. You leave it out because it's so extraordinary. We have talked to the medical examiner in the city of New York, and he has said to us that almost certainly there are human remains, but almost certainly the DNA in them is irretrievable. It has been degraded to the point where it would not reveal identity. So there is nothing that he could do with that material to give something back to the families to confirm the death or to give something. So he can't use the composite. Does it stay at Kennedy Airport indefinitely? We felt that the only thing we could do was to allow that artifact to, in fact, become the civilian equivalent of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, and to place it dramatically and appropriately and sensitively in juxtaposition to a wall that divides public space from the private space of the medical examiner's office, which is this set of offices right back here that will not be publicly accessible. It will not even be accessible to family members. It is where the unidentified remains will repose under the auspices of the city medical examiner. Family members will have a special viewing room, an alcove, where they can go, but they will not enter into the actual repository. The public will only know it's there by signage, and the focal point of this section will be this artifact, this extraordinary artifact from the site, which we will present with reverence, and a quote that we have found from Virgil, from the Aeneid, which of course has within it the tale of a journey to the underworld. And the quote comes, I believe, from Book 9 of the Aeneid, and it is, "No day can erase you from the memory of time." So we are trying to build in layers to the visitor experience that convey the extraordinary nature of this site, that talk about the mythic resonance of the journey the visitor is taking down to bedrock. And we will then move from the emotional, reverential, memorial quality of this space into the North Tower, where we will tell the story of the events of the day, the heroism, the aftermath, the continuing resonance of 9/11. One will go, as we're planning right now, the way the World Trade Center towers were actually lived was that there was a donut area and a core. And the donut area, this area here, were the offices. The core was the mechanical, the elevators and stairs. We're going to try to honor the lived life of the building by creating an exhibition that identifies the core and allows it to be permeable in the journey through, but for moments of reflection or particular artifacts that need to be highlighted. So one will take this journey through here, come out into the West Chamber slurry wall with a view of the exposed slurry wall here. And one of the other great artifacts that we have the privilege to accommodate is the last column, which was, if you followed the news in the months after 9/11, around Memorial Day of 2002, the last beam was removed from the site in a ceremony of great ritual, and the bagpipers were there, and the city officials were there, and the iron workers were there, and the firemen were there, and everybody was in uniform, and they carried this beam out prone as if it were a body and removed it from the site. But the beam itself had been signed. When it first was exposed, the rubble kept going down and down and down and down and down. And the beam came from a portion of the South Tower that was near where many of the firefighters, unfortunately, were lost when the tower collapsed. And when the beam was just poking through the rubble, one of the companies, the fire companies who were helping with the removal of debris from the site, wrote at the top of it, with some notation of the number of people, firefighters who had perished. Right? There's a kind of a marker that, look here for the bodies. And then as the rubble kept going down, and more of the beam was exposed, the Port Authority police put their number on there, and the NYPD put their number on there. And then the ironworkers began to write notes. And it was the graffiti of remembrance. It was people marking something to contain memory. And so this extraordinary beam, which is covered with mementos and paper and missing posters and inscribed memory statements and tributes, we will have as the final artifact that you see after you've left the main exhibition, because we can, in fact, stand it upright again in that space. We can give it its full height. And one will then have the opportunity to either go back down to the South Tower. One could have done that first if they chose, to the exhibitions and presentations there, or one will leave by escalator, returning to Memorial Hall and to the light that's going to filter in from the atrium, returning up to the plaza, enriched, we hope, by this encounter, ennobled by the memory of real people caught in the maelstrom of hatred, of real people who came together in a crisis to help one another. I want to end with a personal reflection, because as I said a few minutes ago, everyone has their 9/11 story, and mine is actually not a 9/11 story, it's a October 10th story. I was in Washington on September 11th. I was, like so many people, stunned by the unfolding events in the news. I was mostly concerned about retrieving my daughter from school. I was not at the Holocaust Museum that day, which was in sightline of the Pentagon and did evacuate. I had recently moved to D.C. But my 9/11 story happened a month later. My husband and I had planned to celebrate our 25th wedding anniversary in New York City by going back to the plaza where we had spent one night on our honeymoon in 1976, because that's all we could afford, and then 25 years later we could only spend one night because that's all we could afford. And we had made the plan 6 months earlier. And we decided, even after 9/11, that we would keep the date. And I will never forget that drive into New York City. You don't realize how much the imprint of those buildings, which were not beloved architectural structures in their time. Many people thought they were an eyesore, but for everybody they were an emblem. To see that skyline without them was shocking. And then we drove through the Holland Tunnel, and there were the firemen with the boots, collecting money for their comrades and the widows and the children of their fallen brothers. And then we got to the plaza, and it was empty. And the doormen were so happy we had come. And then we went to dinner at a very lovely restaurant, a restaurant that any other time would have been filled with tables where people talked to the person in front of them and didn't recognize that there were people sitting adjacent to them 2 inches away. And the entire restaurant was talking across tables from one side to the other. It was astonishing. The waiters and the waitresses and the busboys were talking to the lady in the mink coat over there who was talking to the woman next to me who was talking. I mean, I've never experienced anything like that. And I think for many people who were in New York City in the days and the weeks after 9/11, that spirit of democracy, of neighborliness, of fellow feeling was permeating everywhere. It was palpable. And I think it wasn't just New York City. I think it was the country, and in many ways, for a short period of time, it was the world. There was a recognition of shared humanity and of the basic priority of our common needs over all other matters. We really can't recapture that moment, and I don't think the museum can even begin to do that. You can't recapture that. But it is surely a goal to which we might aspire in a 9/11 world, a post-9/11 world. And that is the ultimate mission of this museum. It's a privilege to have Kristen Haas here, and I want to share a line that I lifted from her wonderful book on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Tribute history. And you wrote, Kristen, that memorials are the way people make promises to the future about the past. So I want to ask you the questions I've been asking myself for the past year, and that I hope we on the staff at the museum will have the privilege to ask going forward. What kind of world do we want our children to inherit? And what kind of promises are we willing to make in the aftermath of 9/11? Thank you very much.
I was struck by one fact or one part of the exhibition hall, and that is for children. And you couch that in the sense that children should not see certain kinds of things, not be a witness to certain sites, whether objects or images or whatever. You didn't go into detail. And I wonder, is there any other memorial site or museum that you know of registering a 20th century disaster? Because that's a whole other question. What happened in the 20th century? It's not just Berlin that proliferates. It's all over the world,
Yes.
actually, including
Yes.
Washington, D.C., your own
Absolutely.
city. But that's another question for a longer period of time. Is there any other museum that has made that choice?
Yes.
And I'd be interested in knowing
Several.
which ones, because I've
Oh,
not heard
several.
that.
Well, of course, my experience is with the Holocaust Museum in Washington, where there is a completely separate exhibition for children under the age of 11 called Daniel's Story. And Daniel's Story really developed in response to a set of meetings that happened early on in the life of the planning of the museum that involved several educational psychologists, including Robert Coles and several other big thinkers, about the cognitive development of children. And we were advised that children under the age of 11 do not have the cognitive apparatus. They don't have either the cognitive apparatus or the contextual information to process traumatic imagery. This is not to say that we don't expose children in our culture all the time to this material, but we do so at great peril because they don't have a way to frame it. So we were advised to create an experience at the Holocaust Museum that would not dumb down the history, would not eschew the hard facts. Daniel's Story, his mother and his sister are murdered, okay? But pay very close attention to how you tell the story so that children can comprehend the facts. And I think 9/11 is really an opportunity to do a similar kind of thing. And it's not just an opportunity, I think we are obligated to do it. I hope we will be able to do that. But the Holocaust Museum isn't the only one. There's a museum.
Are there any outside the United States?
Yes, actually. And by the way, the Holocaust Museum, it's an advisory that we give. Parents still take their kids through. There's a sign that says, recommended for children 11 and older in the permanent exhibition. Kids go through it all the time. So you can't legislate this. I think a museum as a public institution simply has an obligation to provide the alternative. But parents will make their own decisions, But at Yad Vashem, you have a new historical exhibition, but there's also a children's memorial, which is much more of a memorial installation than an educational installation. At the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz up in the Western Galilee, there is a really good smaller Holocaust exhibition, and they have a separate exhibition designed for younger visitors. So there's increasing consciousness about what the impact of this trauma, this history of trauma, has on young children. And I also think that if you want to encourage kids to ask questions, you create the environments where that's welcomed, and somehow an environment where you're showing a picture of somebody, unfortunately, jumping out of a building, which we as adults don't even know how to process. I mean, the controversy over the falling man photo after 9/11 was an adult conversation. We couldn't handle that. How do you expect a 9-year-old to handle that? You know, I mean, I think there are other questions to be asked that are pertinent to the, if you will, the lessons we might learn from 9/11. And we're looking right now at the issue of community. What is a community? Who was your community on 9/11? If you were a kid at one of the schools around the World Trade Center and you couldn't reach your parents and you were, you know, who was your community? Who did you trust? These are big questions in a global community. Who's our community? So we want to allow the essential facts of this story to lead us into conversation that can really be about something beyond the horrific events of that day.
It seems to me that your use of the term memory is a problematic one to some extent, because the museum is also creating something that resembles memory, even though what it's creating may bear relatively little relationship to what actually happened historically. I mean, it's you're layering emotions of memory and visions of memory on it. And one part of the story I'm really curious and really interested to know how you've negotiated, and that is the museum is about the victims of the attack. What about the perpetrators of the attack?
That's a great question.
Because obviously tolerance, how is this going to be viewed in terms of ethnic identification, the start of global hostilities and blah, 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 what 9/11 has come to be understood as and memorialized as in kind of broader, more nationalistic, more hostile discourses.
Right. It's a great question, and we are tempered in our thinking by the experience of other institutions. You know, the Holocaust Museum was specifically about the story being told from the point of view of the victims. Okay, so you actually don't meet the perpetrators, except they're in the background of the images. They're in the images, but you're hearing it from the point of view of the people who are experiencing the escalation of Nazism. You don't get to it until the very end when they're on trial. So you meet them essentially as criminals with the Nuremberg laws, the Nuremberg trials. Oklahoma City did a very different thing. They didn't include Timothy McVeigh when they opened. It was entirely about the victims. And the problem with that approach is that it is it's overly deferential to the feelings of the victims. And of course, Oklahoma City is a small town and everybody knew somebody. But it was as if this happened without human agency. And they have had to retrofit into that exhibition subsequently information about McVeigh, okay, and Terry Nichols. So we take the caution seriously. We see it as part of our mission to talk about the terrorists, to identify them, not to memorialize them. Their names will not be on the memorial, even though they died there too, right? And that's a whole, I mean, we've had this conversation. It's a very complicated issue.
That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. This is not a memorial to the terrorists, but the terrorists will be part of the narrative of the exhibition because you cannot tell this story without them. It's as simple as that. How we do it is, one of our staff who's he's a philosopher, basically. He's writing guidelines and guidelines and guidelines so that we have some set of sort of rational assumptions about how we approach this and how the designers approach it.
I'm interested in hearing you talk about the distinction between your experience at the Holocaust Museum and your thinking about the 9/11 Museum. Partly because so much of our response to 9/11 immediately was remember, remember, remember. And I see that as, I see our desire for memory as actually coming out of, in sort of terms of intellectual history, and coming out of our response to the Holocaust. So the way that the West, sort of in the broadest terms, responded to the Holocaust was with kind of this not immediate, but eventual global imperative to remember, which has then been contagious and has inspired us. How do we respond to what we don't understand? We remember it.
Right.
So I think the Holocaust Museum and the sort of the context of the Holocaust gives us the intensity of the desire to remember it. I think it leads to even maybe to the fact of a memorial museum at the site. Mm-hmm. If this had happened, that seems significant to me.
I think it's what I struggle with is that the Holocaust, particularly I think the Holocaust Museum, I don't know that this is true of all Holocaust memorials, but the Holocaust Museum has moved from the founding assumption of the project, which was you build it and it won't happen again, the never again mantra, to the day it opened with Elie Wiesel, doing this to President Clinton, and to Bill Clinton, and saying, how can you stand there? I can't sleep at night because of what's going on in Bosnia, and how can you stand there doing nothing? So the day the museum opened, you had this recognition that never again wasn't going to wash, right? So if it wasn't never again, what was the point of remembering, right? Other than that it's the right human thing to do, right? So you dig deeper and you say there is a reason for remembrance, okay? And I come out of a very specific tradition where this is an imperative. The Jewish tradition takes memory and institutionalizes it into a Seder every year, where every year you reenact verbally and with your food the same thing that has been happening for the last, 3,500 years. It's like, and the point is that you read the Haggadah and it's a chapbook about ethical behavior. Be good to the widow. Don't avoid the stranger in your midst. Don't put a stumbling block in front of the blind. It's a moral guidebook based on a recollection, an enforced, ceremonialized recollection of the imperative to remember what happened to you, right? So I think that the whole shift of how memory is approached at the Holocaust Museum actually comes out of a very Jewish core. I don't think anyone there would say that because it's a federal institution and it's not a Jewish story and all this stuff. But it's a fundamentally Judeo-Christian ethic about the value of memory, and that the way you remember, the reason you remember, it's your question that I just quoted, is why are you remembering? You're remembering so you can be a better human being. If you can't remember what happened to you, you can't make it better for the next generation.
And then that comes back to the question of, and I love the example you gave of grievance, because the use of that language on your part was like lightning.
Oh yeah.
So how do you make us all better people with the memory that you produce, if you can't say grievance? And
I think we have to say
challenge.
grievance.
Yeah.
I think if this museum doesn't say grievance, we're not doing our job. We can't be ostriches. You can't put your head in the sand. We were saying at the table tonight, we live in a world where communication is global. The economy is global. We all saw that last week. What happened in the Asian markets affected my investments in New York, okay? We are totally connected globally, and yet the values are local, okay? And if we can't accept that, whether we agree with the grievance or not, we have to accept that there are people in this world who don't appreciate our lifestyle. Now, we can either choose to ignore that at our own peril, or we can confront that and say, what are we going to do about that? Where are the points of communication? Where is the intersection? How do you negotiate that with people who don't want to negotiate? Somebody's got to ask those questions. I think this museum has an obligation. Now, can we do that aggressively when we open the doors? No, I don't think so. I think I think these things it's about the lived life of an institution that has to evolve over time. And I think we recognize that the first thing we have to do is honor memory for memory's sake, that people died here, and the first thing you do is you pay attention to that. But there is a bigger vision, I think, for the long haul, or else this place, look, it's going to get eclipsed very quickly. I hate to say that. I don't mean to be a doomsdayer, but we live in a world where 9/11 will not be singular at some point. And I've got to create an institution that's going to survive and have meaning, even when there is another event that eclipses the one we're documenting. Much as the Holocaust Museum, I mean, there hasn't been a genocide of the magnitude in terms of numbers, but you don't do comparative numbers with genocide. That misses the point. The Holocaust Museum becomes the point of entry for a recognition that this is not going away, this is part of human nature. What's our obligation when we know it's happening? Right?
When I visited Hiroshima, the Peace Park and the museum, I was really struck by the spirit of forgiveness and the emphasis on plea to the world for nuclear disarmament, and
Right.
an absence, at least from my experience in the museum, of vindictiveness and hostility towards the country that had been at war, obviously, the United States. So I don't know at what time that museum was created relative to the nuclear attack. It might take a few decades before a museum can communicate that.
Right.
But I'm wondering if that's part of the long-term vision for this museum, because I didn't hear it in your response to the last few questions.
Well, actually, I can't speak to personal experience at Hiroshima. I haven't been, but several of my staff members have. And what I understand, for those of you, maybe someone here has been there, that there was the original Hiroshima Museum that was created somewhat closer, or in relatively closer proximity to the event. There's a second museum. They didn't just update their museum, they created a second memorial museum at the site that tells a slightly different story. So I don't know if as they've gotten further away from the event, they can begin to take a harder look at I just don't know, because I haven't been there myself, but I do know that there are two institutions at Hiroshima.
You mentioned some of the physical artifacts that you had included, and I was approaching it from the perspective of slavery museums or African American history museums, and the use of physical restraints or cages or those things. And how do you see the museum? Could you mention more of the other physical objects that you're incorporating into the museum itself? And then the thought of, do you see other museums across the country opening up? I know there's many museums across the country that honor slavery or the history of the South.
And Holocaust memorials are everywhere.
Sure. So do you see your museum maybe influencing the way other museums open up in the future?
Well, I'll take your second question first and then get back to the other artifacts. I think it's unlikely you would, there are already a number of 9/11 memorials around the country. These civic memorials that have been set up. And I think that those will continue as communities do want to commemorate either family members or companies that have headquarters around the country or whatever, that there is a sense of wanting to pay homage. I don't imagine other museums. There will be, I think, 3 at the Pentagon. There are 3 different memorial installations at the Pentagon, and of course there's going to be a national museum at Shanksville. But I think the particularity of our site really would make it unlikely that there would be a proliferation of World Trade Center memorial museums. The artifacts is a really interesting question because, the obvious artifacts are these monumental pieces of steel and the crushed fire trucks and the sort of the big stuff. But we also are building a collection, and the collection is, intimate memorabilia, personal effects. So you have Lieutenant Mickey Cross, for example, a retired firefighter who was, he miraculously survived the collapse of the North Tower. He was in a stairwell, and the way the building fell, he was literally in a pocket of air with everything around him collapsing, and there he was. He was fine. But he gave us his helmet, his battered helmet, and when he talks about it, he's like, he doesn't even have the helmet anymore, and he's like talking about how he tried to hide under his helmet. He was like getting into this helmet for protection. And it's so real and it's so vivid, and that helmet, it tells a whole story, and a remarkable story. So we are collecting the personal effects that allow us to tell the stories that are just extraordinary. you know, stories of survival and resilience and courage and the unimaginable. Thank you.